This is the story of Homo sapiens. And this is the moment for spinning that story together from two strands: the archaeological information from the Epi-palaeolithic and early Neolithic periods in Southwest Asia, with accounts of the co-evolution of human cognition and symbolic culture. It's the story of the tipping point, when human groups first began to abandon their biologically inherited form of what I've referred to as fission-fusion social organization in favor of life in permanently co-resident communities of increasing size. Because we can place this tipping point in an evolutionary context, the co-evolution of human cognition and symbolic culture, we can finally answer that question that pressed on Robert Braidwood throughout the decades of his pioneering research. Why then? Why not earlier? Because Homo sapiens became Homo symbolicus. The early excavations of Mount Carmel caves by Dorothy Garrett in the 1930s produced a number of human fossils that were problematic at the time and remained problematic for many decades. Were they a local group of rather gracile Neanderthals? Were they Neanderthals in the process of becoming emergent Homo sapiens? Were they hybrid Neanderthal Homo sapiens mixed marriages? Now the specialists know what archaic Homo sapiens looks like, and the bodies buried at two caves that Dorothy Garrett excavated have been recognized as early Homo sapiens. Now that there are more Neanderthal skeletons known, it has also become clear that the other burials in the Mount Carmel caves are indeed advanced and rather light-boned Neanderthals. The caves at Kafse and Eshkul in the Mount Carmel hills of northern Israel both have Homo sapiens burials. This is the double burial of an adult and a child from Kafse, and there are two skulls now agreed by experts such as Chris Stringer to be Homo sapiens. In terms of material culture, the strata in which Homo sapiens lived and buried their dead are indistinguishable from those in which indigenous Neanderthals are present at other sites. And if the Homo sapiens skeletons represent deliberate burials, then the Neanderthal skeletons in the other case almost certainly do so too. When the results from newly available dating techniques such as thermoluminescence, electron spin resonance and uranium series came out in the early 1990s, they surprised everyone. The date for the Kafse Homo sapiens burials came out at 92,000 years ago on all three methods. The Neanderthal burials dated around 60,000 years ago. These are the earliest Homo sapiens outside Africa, the first evidence of the beginnings of world colonization by our species. Now we move to the neighbouring cave of Eshkul, where at least 10 Homo sapiens burials were found. One of those burials had a large boar mandible placed in its arms. Recently, 2 perforated marine shells that were excavated by Dorothy Garrett have been dated by means of the still adhering matrix from the cave. At between 100 and 130,000 years old, these are the oldest known examples of the fashioning of shells as personal ornaments, older than any of the Middle Stone Age examples reported in recent years from South Africa, and older than any of the South African occurrences of the use of red ochre. At Kibara, another Mount Carmel cave, Dorothy Garrett found more burials, but these are now agreed to be Neanderthals. The new dating for the final Mousterian strata in which these burials occur is around 60,000 years ago, 30 to 50,000 years later than the Homo sapiens burials. Here is one of the Neanderthal skulls, this one from the cave of Tabun, but the Tabun cave has proved difficult to date. From a more recent excavation at the cave of Amud, further east in Israel, here is another Neanderthal skull. These deposits have been dated around 57,000 years ago. The Neanderthal burials too pose questions concerning their cognitive faculties. Were they emulating Homo sapiens burial practices and the ideas that they document, or is it a case of parallel independent development? But these questions are not our concern here. What we can say is that from at least 100,000 years ago, that is about halfway through the history of our species, Homo sapiens had begun to demonstrate the kind of consciousness, the capacity for abstract ideas, the formulation of ritualized behavior that had convinced a number of Paleolithic specialists to talk of an upper Paleolithic or human revolution. As the dates from the sites in Israel have been taken on board, and as new data on the very early use of marine shells and red ochre in South Africa have been published, it has become clear that the idea of an upper Paleolithic revolution at around 30,000 years ago was false and based on a narrowly European perspective. It just so happens that Europe was one of the last parts of the world which Homo sapiens bothered to colonize. Both Clive Gamble and Stephen Mython have made the point that there is a step change between these earliest indications of symbolic behavior, pierced marine shells, use of red ochre, and what we see in the upper Paleolithic in Western Europe of 2- and 3-dimensional art. The evolution of human cognitive faculties and symbolic culture has been a long process, therefore. Just as the upper Paleolithic was not the beginning, we now know, I'm saying, so it wasn't the end. The kind of capacity for symbolic culture that we have seen in the late Epi-palaeolithic and the early Neolithic is a whole order different from what we can see in the European upper Paleolithic between 30 and 14,000 years ago. The transition from the middle to the upper Paleolithic had taken place in the Levant by 47,000 years ago. The upper Paleolithic is still a period known best from chipstone. The beginning of the period is marked by a typological rather than a technological change. One specialist wrote recently, "The initial Levantine Upper Paleolithic hardly differs in material culture terms from the local Middle Paleolithic." It's a smooth transition, presumably because Homo sapiens simply continued where they'd already been for more than 50,000 years, although the Neanderthals by that time had disappeared. 8,000 or 9,000 years into the Upper Paleolithic period, and we encounter a situation where there are two lithic traditions, quite distinct. Even I can see the difference when you put the drawings together of the two traditions, but they're coexisting. Now that we've got dating methods which go back that far, we're finding that these are not a succession of cultural traditions or lithic traditions, as used to be assumed by Dorothy Garrett and generations later than that. Radiocarbon and other dating now shows that these are synchronous, parallel, distinctly different traditions, representing groups of people who lived within the Levant side by side, but maintaining small but no doubt significant differences which distinguished us from them for many thousands of years, each pursuing their own trajectories of only just perceptible change and never converging. In southern Israel and Jordan, survey teams have found open campsites of Upper Paleolithic date. One in particular, in southern Israel, was first used at the end of the Middle Paleolithic and continued to be used from time to time over the early millennia of the Upper Paleolithic period. Spatial analysis of the chipstone shows that the groups who used this campsite in the Upper Paleolithic period tended to organize their use of the site rather more than their Middle Paleolithic predecessors. And that's about it. What you've seen in the background in this slide is the cave site at Uçayazlı, in early Upper Paleolithic site in the Turkish Hatay, near the mouth of the Orontes, and among the finds are perforated marine shells, including some with red ochre still adhering. By contrast with the Middle Paleolithic, the Upper Paleolithic has yielded hardly any burials, and only the standard information about continued hunting practices. There are a few groundstone implements that indicate that there was some interest in harvesting and processing seeds and grasses and grains. The number of examples of representational art is tiny, and they're nothing more than the occasional flat stones on which simple sketches have been incised. If none of the famous painted cave sites in the West had been discovered, it is hard to imagine the idea of an Upper Paleolithic or human revolution would have come to mind on the basis of what we have from the Upper Paleolithic in Southwest Asia. The two American archaeologists excavating at Uçayazlı have recently published a study of the animal bones from a number of sites, their own included, covering the Middle Paleolithic to the end of the Epi-palaeolithic. you may recall that I talked in the second lecture about the evidence for increasingly serious pressure on the species that were hunted in the Epi-palaeolithic and into the beginning of the Neolithic. This new study argues that the first signs of that pressure on the availability of prey species can be detected in the Upper Paleolithic period, and they attribute that pressure to an increase in population density of the human hunters. The beginning of the Epi-palaeolithic period is marked by changes in the chipstone industries. Throughout Southwest Asia, people became interested in making most of their tools by retouch on small bladelets. Many bladelets were craftily fashioned into highly stylized microliths. It's very different from Europe, Western Europe. The Middle Paleolithic lasted about 200,000 years with almost no detectable cultural change over all that time, as I mentioned before. The Upper Paleolithic, 25,000 years, where the experts can detect change over time. We get into the Epi-palaeolithic, lasting 10,000 years and a bit more, and the lithic specialists can enjoy themselves recognizing regional traditions as well as changing patterns through time. Two Israeli archaeologists recently wrote, I quote, "The duration of each cultural entity in the Epi-palaeolithic, as opposed to the Upper Paleolithic in earlier periods, does conform to what some consider the legitimate duration of an archaeological culture." In other words, with the Epi-palaeolithic, we've crossed into an archaeology that can be talked about as we talk about the Neolithic and later prehistoric periods. And with the Epi-palaeolithic, the trajectory of cultural and social change in Southwest Asia diverges really significantly from the contemporary Upper Paleolithic, later Upper Paleolithic in Western Europe. What I emphasized in the third lecture was the long trend towards sedentism and reliance on stored harvests of cereals and grasses and pulses, together with a significant shift towards a broad spectrum strategy in hunting. But things are never simple. Even at the beginning of the Epi-palaeolithic, the little brush huts at Ahalo II exhibit formalized behaviors that are difficult to account for in strictly utilitarian terms. The floors of the huts, if you remember, showed carefully structured indications of use and reuse, and at the end of their use lives the huts were burnt rather than simply abandoned. In the last 2 or 3 millennia of the Epi-palaeolithic, there were settlements of substantial stone-built circular structures clustered together in what we can easily think of as villages, and you will recall Malaha in the north of Israel. But you may also recall that the structures of the early period at Malaha were built and rebuilt several times in excavated hollows, revetted by stone walls and without disturbing clusters of burials under the floor. Phil Edwards and his colleagues carefully examined the distributions of all sorts of artifacts and bone and all sorts of things from their excavation at Wadi Hamed 27, contemporary with Malaha. We saw it earlier in the series. The concentration of material within the two structures is very striking in contrast with the distribution of materials outside. Here's a density plot of the total artifacts. The numbers in circles represent distinct caches of objects, like the basalt mortars and pestles that we saw yesterday, or the caches of sickles. The density of animal bone is very similar. And what is very noticeable is that it's almost all within the structures. Outside the structures is 0. Very strange. When we turn to the human bone, there are 4 burials marked in red on this plan. One of them is off plan to the right. But there is a scatter of human cranial material, bits of human skulls, throughout the two structures, and I've coloured them orange. I want to reinforce the point that we cannot see these structures and these settlements as simply clusters of houses providing shelter. The house and the settlement from the outset are subject to structuring principles, although the rationale is by no means transparent and simple for us to understand. We have seen the tipping point. By the end of the Epi-palaeolithic, or the beginning of the earliest Neolithic, loosely around 10,000 BC, people in Southwest Asia had fundamentally changed their way of life. For thousands of years, for more than 100,000 years, Homo sapiens had lived in small-scale communities made up of small bands in a form that is described as nowadays as fission-fusion societies. All earlier species in the genus Homo, like our nearest primate cousins, had lived as fission-fusion societies. We can hardly turn to climatic change and environmental pressure as the force that required human adaptation. The shift towards harvesting and storing plant foods and the broad-spectrum hunting strategy carried on against a background of climatic oscillations. First the last glacial maximum, then the recovery, then the Younger Dryas cold phase, then the Neolithic early Holocene optimum. Some have suggested that increasing population densities drove the shift towards sedentism, storage, and a broad-spectrum hunting strategy. For myself, I'm persuaded by the arguments for increasing population density within the Levant, from the Upper Paleolithic, in the Epi-palaeolithic, and increasing through the early Neolithic, and increasing even more sharply after the adoption of farming. The only region for which we have good evidence is unfortunately the Levant, but I think we can perhaps speak of wider parts of Southwest Asia being involved. But I suspect that Homo sapiens had evolved an internal dynamism that selected for larger communities living together and enjoying richly symbolic cultural environments. There are risks and costs, but there are also advantages to living in larger communities at higher population densities in the landscape. And the long-term trajectory in hominid evolution, as I was talking about in the previous lecture, if we are to follow the line of argument proposed by Robin Dunbar, among others, was to evolve a larger, more powerful brain that could facilitate the individual's engagement in exponentially more complex social relations, which ensured larger, stronger, more cohesive social groups. Whatever the driving force, what I'm particularly concerned to emphasize is that this trend that led to life in large, permanent, co-resident communities could not have taken place without the modern human capacity for managing systems of symbolic representation. I have been deeply influenced by Anthony Cohen's ideas in the symbolic construction of community. Cohen wrote, for example, when we speak of people acquiring culture or learning to be social, we mean that they acquire the symbols which will equip them to be social. And then later, the reality of community in people's experience thus inheres in their attachment or commitment to the common body of symbols. And he in turn acknowledges his debt to the revered anthropologist Clifford Geertz, who in his book, The Interpretation of Cultures, defined culture as, and I quote again, a system of inherited conceptions expressed in symbolic forms by means of which people communicate, perpetuate, and develop their knowledge about and attitudes toward life. I tell you these things simply to indicate where I'm coming from. You will recall that Robin Dunbar, among a number of psychologists, concluded that the capacity of the modern human brain, the physical brain, not the mind, imposes an effective limit of around 150 on the size of group within which the individual can keep track of the social relations. We can also turn to the sociologists and psychologists who have used social network analysis, or we can take a shortcut through the groundbreaking work of Clive Gamble, who introduced the ideas from social network analysis into his study of the European Paleolithic societies published 10 years ago. And the psychologist Merlin Donald, whose ideas on external symbolic storage I talked about in the previous lecture, has powerful things to say about the role of symbolic culture in human life and its evolutionary emergence. Clive Gamble employed social network analysis in his study of Paleolithic societies. Sociologists analyze social networks in contemporary Western situations. It focuses on the patterning of people's interactions. I've borrowed this diagram from Clive Gamble. It indicates, in general terms, the scale of the three levels of social network in which the individual may engage, the intimate, effective, and extended network. And it shows what kinds of resources are needed for the different levels, emotional, material, and symbolic. The figures in the column labelled scale are an indication of the size of network of each type that the individual might be expected to engage in. Clive discusses these matters and documents them quite extensively, but here I'm abbreviating things to the barest essentials. The intimate network is the small number of kin and friends who are our closest intimates. The intimate network depends primarily on emotional resources, and don't we know it if we've got teenage children, face-to-face contact and frequent reaffirmation. The effective network are quote, those people who provide the individual with material and emotional assistance during the routines of daily life. So a bit further out, numbering up to about 20. The third level of network is the extended network. That's the one that I'm interested in. It's made up of acquaintances and friends of friends, ranging from people you want to keep in touch with from time to time, to people whom you encounter in everyday life but on only the most casual basis. We use symbolic and stylistic resources, especially in our relations with people in our extended networks. People we don't see regularly, maybe see only very rarely, but with whom we want to maintain relations, with the exchange of Christmas cards, perhaps. Because it illustrates, it's a nice example, because it illustrates how our symbolic interaction with Christmas wishes is often, in fact usually, accompanied by a material token. Perhaps nowadays more by e-tokens. It is not difficult for us to recognize that keeping relationships alive requires at least occasional interaction, and interactions are more than recalling an old acquaintance and thinking about them. In Clive Gamble's analysis, the extended network appears only amongst Homo sapiens in the European Upper Paleolithic. Social networks among Neanderthals in the Middle Paleolithic and earlier hominids were significantly constrained by comparison in his analysis. Relations in the extended network in the Upper Paleolithic were maintained through irregular and often indirect exchange of material things whose symbolic values were their most important component. There are 3 points that are important for us. First, while emotional resources are the most important in our intimate networks, extended networks require symbolic resources, that is, the exchange, albeit occasional exchanges, of tokens that will sustain the relationship and lead to further reciprocal exchange or calling on someone for help or aid at some future date. Second, Clive Gamble's examination of the Paleolithic concluded that extended networks emerged only with Homo sapiens in the Upper Paleolithic. Along with that came the ability to conceive of and construct social landscapes as never before. Third, the population of many of the settlements of the Neolithic exceeded the scale of the individual's extended network. That means that in any such settlement, many of the inhabitants would not be part of any of the social networks of any particular individual. These communities, therefore, were devising new ways, new symbolic ways, of locking individuals into networks of community identity which far exceeded the capacity of the biological brain. What we see in the Neolithic is qualitatively different from the first serious beginnings that have excited the Paleolithic specialists. What we see in the Neolithic, traceable back into the Epi-palaeolithic, are large, permanently co-resident communities of hundreds of people, in some cases thousands of people, for hundreds of years. Seeing this site reminds me I'm going to be there in about a month's time. I've argued that these communities are essentially egalitarian and organized in a segmentary form and not in hierarchical socially stratified societies. We've seen how some early Neolithic communities structured their settlements and the ways in which they went about their daily lives. Here again, just to remind you, is the site of Wadi Finan 16, WF16 in southern Jordan, currently under excavation, with one side of the settlement, the heaped up debris material and workshop area away from the houses. Or there is the contemporary settlement further north in the north of Syria, Jerf al-Akhmar, which we've looked at several times, where the houses cluster around a central area within which the largest and most elaborate structure, a subterranean building which may have served both for communal food storage and certain ceremonies. Its location within the village, its distinctive architecture and its scale surely tell us of its central significance to the community. We saw that domestic architecture was important to communities in different parts of our region in different ways. At Chayanu in southeastern Turkey, houses were monumental, two-story constructions that conformed to norms that changed over time. At Çatalhöyük, Ian Hodder has begun to describe the domestic buildings as memory houses. Houses were continually replastered and repainted. In some, elaborate symbols formed on the skulls of hunted wild bulls were modelled on the wall or the floor, and there is evidence here and there for ceremonies in which numbers of people feasted on hunted beef. Bodies were buried beneath the plastered benches at one side of the room, and their locations, and no doubt their identities, were remembered. At Ashkelhiyuk, a little earlier in central Anatolia, people would have been aware that their houses were built just where an earlier generation's house had stood. They may have been aware that the histories of their families and their community beneath their feet stretched back many centuries. The tradition of incorporating burials among the living can be traced back to the first appearance of Homo sapiens in the southern Levant. From the Epi-palaeolithic, as communities began to agglomerate towards permanent settlement, the tradition became the focus for ceremonies as bodies were buried among the houses or under the floors of houses. In the Levant, southeast Turkey, central Anatolia, we saw how different communities elaborated those rituals increasingly over time. You will recall Ian Kite's diagrams showing how in the Levant individuals were first the focus of burial ceremonies, followed after some time by further ceremonies as the grave was reopened and the skull was recovered. The skulls were curated, in some instances facial features being modelled on them, and then finally clutches of curated skulls were reburied, no doubt accompanied by further ceremonies. The great round tower attached to the wall around the early Aceramic Neolithic Jericho was interpreted by Kathleen Kenyon as part of the defensive system. Not surprising, since she'd been brought up by Sir Mortimer Wheeler excavating Iron Age fortifications here in Britain. It now seems that this structure had a rather different function, for you will recall that a series of human burials had taken place inside the doorway at its base. There was no prescribed liturgy for the dead, and each community seems to have developed their own ideas over time. I can't help but introduce this powerful image just one more time. It comes from excavations that finished in 2006 at Tel Aswad, about 30 kilometers east of Damascus in Syria, and it dates in the region of 8,000 to 7,500 BC. This is one of the two caches of model skulls found. Each was a kind of foundation deposit in an area near the margin of the settlement that was cleared of houses in order to become a funerary area. The deposit of model skulls was followed by burial after burial in one of the two funerary areas, amounting to 22 individuals. Some were primary inhumations, others secondary burials, that is, the collected bones brought from a burial elsewhere, the other area producing at least 20 individuals. What is intriguing about these funerary areas and these foundation deposits of model skulls is the recognition that the burying of a clutch of model skulls is itself the final ceremony in one cycle, being used as the initial ceremony in the initiation of a new round of ceremonies. So these skulls mark the point where one cycle ended in the starting of another. Just two examples to refresh your memory of what we've seen of the extraordinarily diverse communal buildings or special purpose buildings in Neolithic settlements. At the heart of the settlement at Jadeh in North Syria, a French-Syrian team is excavating this massive circular building that's still only part exposed. It has two massive internal buttresses or stub walls, and there will be a third, it looks like. This is the first one to emerge, and it is covered, as you can see, with what looks uncannily like 20th century abstract painting. Watch this space. There will be exciting news to come from this excavation over coming years. And here is one of the huge subterranean structures at Göbekli Tepe near Urfa in southeast Turkey. Circles, as I was telling you, were repeatedly rebuilt and reshaped. Huge cavities were formed to contain circles. Circles were ultimately obliterated by being filled in. Stones were repeatedly moved to new positions and recarved. So far we've only seen a few of them as photographs in the preliminary publications. From the Epi-palaeolithic through the early Neolithic, we see regional and supra-regional networks of exchange and the sharing of ideas and practices and imagery that became more intensive with time. It wasn't enough to form large, permanently resident communities with the load of symbolic interaction that required. Communities devoted great efforts to play their part in the maintenance of widespread networks, in some ways similar to what Colin Renfrew has called peer polity interaction spheres. What we see in the archaeology is some of the materials that were exchanged, of which the best known was obsidian from sources in central and eastern Anatolia, and I bring back this map to remind you of some of the other materials that were prized for exchange. We also see evidence of interaction through the exchange and sharing of ideas and techniques and imagery. Denise Dorder reported these incised plaques from Jebel Ahmar a few years ago, and already 2 or 3 more excavations in North Syria and southeast Turkey are reporting similar finds and some identical recurrent recurrent signs. The anthropomorphic monoliths from Nevalachori are repeated at Göbekli Tepe, but there are 2 or 3 other sites in southeast Turkey and North Syria that are also producing more, not identical, but each community developing its own style and its own interpretations. By the middle of the 9th millennium BC, cultivation of cereals and pulses had been underway for long enough to produce the first recognizably domesticated species of wheat and barley, as well as lentils, beans and chickpeas. Soon the first fully domesticated flocks of sheep and goat were being herded, together with cattle and pig. The take-up of mixed farming was rapid all around the hilly flank zone and beyond, and it was followed by rapid increase of population, perceptible to us as the increase in the number of the sites of the later Islamic Neolithic, and the increase in their average size, and the increase in the density of occupation within the sites. Within Southwest Asia, it is possible to chart the expansion of farming communities into regions that had previously not supported a hunter-gatherer population, notably the plains of northern Mesopotamia and the flat alluvium of southern Iraq and southwest Iran. And of course the expansion continued, but that, as they say, is another story. In his books, Gordon Childs showed by example that prehistoric archaeology could be told as a form of history. He introduced to prehistory the idea that there were revolutions, times when the direction of change took a new course, when the curve on the graph took a sharp upward kick. I have the greatest respect for Clive Gamble's work, and his recent book, Origins and Revolutions, clearly draws on his great academic experience, his wide reading and deep thought. He is deeply critical of the way that archaeologists seem to be overly concerned to search for the origins of everything and over-eager to dramatize their findings by discovering revolutions everywhere. If you can't find the earliest example, then it has to be a revolution. The body of the book focuses on the human revolution, Upper Paleolithic, Western Europe, and the Neolithic revolutions, with both of which concepts he has no sympathy. You can guess what the answer is going to be from the title of his chapter 8. Did agriculture change the world? On reflection, however, I still think that the changes that we've been considering amount to a revolution, when history took a turn and sets out in a new direction and things began to happen at a greater pace. For those generations that lived out this transformation, the new form of co-resident community marked a break with an age-old human, hominid and primate tradition of small mobile groups of flexible membership components in communities that met only occasionally. The new communities not only lived together permanently, but did so in large numbers. This intense compression of extended networks into a single settlement required rich symbolic culture in many forms, continual interaction in the form of ceremonies, rituals, celebrations, shared imagery and signalling. If the scenario that I've outlined for Southwest Asia involves the coevolution of genes and culture, of cognition and culture, it should apply mutatis mutandis across the species of Homo sapiens. Since the cultural context is the primary driving factor, things will not happen everywhere in the same way, or indeed necessarily at the same rate, or exactly the same time around the globe. Therefore the question must be, are similar phenomena present among human populations in other parts of the world at a broadly similar date, i.e. around the end of the Pleistocene, beginning of the Holocene? Obviously, in view of the nature of European Upper Paleolithic artistic and representational material, we should expect to find the process of emergence of symbolic culture there, without the need to wait for the arrival of the Neolithic from elsewhere. I suspect that a good case might be constructed for more or less synchronous emergence of fully symbolic culture around the world, but that is for the future. At present, we can chart the beginnings of farming, which in Southwest Asia followed the emergence of the new type of community. The adoption of farming also coincides, give or take a few centuries, in Southwest Asia, 2 parts of China. Since it's believed that the colonization of the Americas only began very late in the Pleistocene, around 15 or 13,000 years ago, we might expect the developments that we have been considering in Southwest Asia to be somewhat delayed. But in recent years, there have been several surprises. The first dates for urban centres in South America are being shifted back very close to those for the earliest urbanism in Mesopotamia in recent years. And last week, and I mean this, last week, a paper was published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences of the United States, which took the date for the first cultivation and domestication of maize and squash in Mexico back to 7000 BC. Yeah? So things are not fixed yet, there's things happening. We've not finished learning yet. I look forward to more surprises and maybe corroboration of what we've seen in Southwest Asia in other parts of the world. But for now, though, I think I've said quite enough. Thank you very much indeed.